Hello and welcome. Today we are with Dr. Tom Cowan. Dr. Tom Cowan has been interviewed several times on this channel before. He is a wealth of knowledge. He's a doctor out in the Bay Area in California. He's also a founding member of the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is the foundation that has promoted traditional diets for a really long time now. And it's a foundation that really changed my life and has taught me about what it means to eat like a human and to be healthy. And the last interview I published with Dr. Cowan was in January, and it was about the immune system, or we could say the immune systems. We talked about the difference between the cell-mediated immune response and the humoral immune response. And today we're going to talk to Dr. Cowan about viruses. And my first question for Dr. Cowan is, what is a virus? So thank you, Dr. Cowan, for being here. And if you want to say a couple of words, and then I really want to answer that question, what is a virus?
Yeah, so, thanks for talking to me again. And it's actually, in some ways, a complicated question. The corollary to that question is, it's actually a good question. What is a virus, and how do you know if a virus causes illness? So a virus is a piece of either DNA or RNA. DNA is the basic so-called genetic material of basically everything. Mm-hmm. And then in mammals and humans and everything else, really, the DNA is transcribed into RNA, which then gets translated into proteins, which are the action items. So a virus is a piece of DNA or RNA in some cases, with some other proteins in it, that's surrounded by a capsule or a membrane. Now, it turns out that membrane or capsule comes from the cell wall of the host in which the virus lives. So if you're talking classic viral theory, which isn't 100% accurate, but it's at least a place to start, this piece of DNA gets injected into a host cell because the virus can't, quote, live outside of another host cell like a mammal. There is no free living viruses. They're not technically living things. Mm-hmm. So this piece of DNA gets injected into a host cell. It takes over the machinery of the host cell, makes hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of copies of its own DNA. These bud out through the cell membrane of the host, and the cell membrane of the host becomes the capsule for the virus, and that gets put out into the blood or the secretions. So that's what a virus is. I'm sorry to be so technical, but that's really the only answer you can give. The important question here then is, so you have this, this piece of genetic material, usually DNA, but in the case of coronavirus, it's actually RNA, that has a few other proteins in it, and then surrounded by a capsule which comes from the cell membrane of the host. So the question is, how do we know if these, quote, viruses cause disease? That's really the central question here, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's what everybody's talking about right now. So it turns out, as with most of life, there's rules that we sort of play by. I mean, a lot of us don't like rules, but anyways, there are rules that govern whether you can say that a virus is causing a certain disease. And let's take a simpler example, because you can apply this to, how do you know if a microorganism, so now we're talking about viruses, bacteria, or even fungi, how do you know if they're causing a disease? So let's take an example of meningococcal meningitis. Meningococcal meningitis is a bacteria. Now, here's the situation. If everybody with meningococcal meningitis has a very high fever, they have a very characteristic rash, which essentially looks the same with everybody, and in 100% of those people with that scenario, those symptoms and that rash, if you culture their blood, meaning you take some blood and you put it on a petri dish, it will grow out that bacteria, right? So you can say they have an infection, or they have that bacteria growing in their blood. 100% of those people. Now, the next step is if you take 100 normal people, so those were 100 people with those symptoms, and they all had meningococcus growing in their blood. Now you take 100 similarly aged people like you and I, and we're fine, and you do a culture of our blood, and none of us will grow out meningococcus in our blood. None of us. It's not compatible with being fine. In other words, there's no people walking around growing out meningococcus in their blood. Now, once you know that, then you can actually make a pure culture of meningococcus. In other words, you can grow it, you can isolate it, and if you want, you can inject it into another person, which nobody would do, but you could inject it into an animal, which they do, and that animal, if it's susceptible, not all animals will be, but if you find one that is, they will 100% get meningococcal meningitis and die. So that's what we call Koch's postulates. They've been around over 100 years, and that's how we prove microbiological cause of an illness. Now, let's take another example, chickenpox. Chickenpox usually happens in children. There's a very characteristic set of symptoms, low-grade fever, sometimes a little higher, they don't feel good. Then they have this vesicular, meaning bubbly rash, and that looks like chickenpox. If doctors looking at that, if you take 100 children in that scenario, 100% of them will have millions of copies of chickenpox virus in their blood and in their respiratory secretions and in the vesicles on their skin, the blisters. On the other hand, or similarly, nobody like you or I, if you'd cultured our blood or looked at it under an electron microscope, you will find no examples of chickenpox virus in our blood. Zero. If you take that chickenpox virus that you found in our blood, you find it with an electron microscope, and you purify it so that you know that that's all you have, and you inject it into a susceptible animal, they will get chickenpox. That's how we prove it. Now, there is another way that people are using, which are called surrogate tests. And I apologize for being so sort of wonky about this, but this is key to people understanding what's happening.
Okay.
A surrogate test means you don't want to go through the trouble of culturing the bacteria or looking at it, the virus on an electron microscope. So you want to do a test that's quicker and easier to tell you whether you have the virus or the bacteria. That's called a surrogate test. So you take a piece of the RNA or DNA that you know comes from the virus or bacteria, and then you amplify it in certain by certain techniques. And you say, yes, we now know that there's a unique piece of DNA in a meningococcal bacteria, and we found that. We look for it in your blood. We amplify it through these cycles, and if we find that, that proves that you had meningococcus. Mm-hmm. The example that I give to people with this, it's like you go to a small town and you want to know how many feet there are in that small town. And I mean like feet that we walk on, right? So obviously the best way to do it is to get everybody in the town and count their feet. Then you say you have 4,000 feet in Iowa or whatever. Now, that's called the gold standard test because it's 100% accurate, just like the meningococcus and the electron microscope. Now, if you want to go to another town and be quicker about it, you can say, I don't want to bother counting everybody's feet. I know that everybody with a foot has a shoe, and everybody with a shoe has a shoelace. So I'm going to just count how many shoelaces there were sold in this store, and that's going to tell me how many people have feet in Florida. The problem, that's called a surrogate test because you're not actually counting feet, you're counting something that you say tells you how many feet. Mm-hmm. Now, the obvious trouble with that is A, there may be some people who don't have shoes. B, some people might have 2 pairs of shoes or 20 pairs of shoes. I've heard there's actually cases like that. And some of the shoes may not even have shoelaces. I actually have a pair of those myself. So, and not everybody buys their shoes from that town and that one store in the town. They may have bought it online. And so clearly surrogate tests, if you don't compare it rigorously to the foot counting thing, they will give you an erroneous answer. Now, we compare that to the current situation. Now, here's how it should have happened. There's a bunch of people who are sick in a city like Wuhan or Iowa or somewhere. 500 of them. They have a new illness. But the reality is the people who are sick here don't have a new illness. They have cough and fever. So unlike meningococcus and unlike chickenpox, we're not dealing with a very specific and new set of symptoms. We're dealing with people who have very common symptoms, meaning cough and fever. They could have pneumonia, they could have viral pneumonia, they could have walking pneumonia, they could have smoker's cough, they could have air pollution, they could have God knows what. So we don't know. So then I would have said, okay, 500 people, let's look at their blood under electron microscopy, which is the only way to see it, and see if all 500 of them in their either blood or respiratory secretions have only that virus called coronavirus in hundreds, thousands, millions of copies, and they don't have anything else. But here's the funny part. Nobody did that. And I can't emphasize that enough. Nobody did that. There's, as far as I know, and I would be happy to be proven wrong about this, but I am, basically 100% sure I won't be. that nobody did an electron microscopy examination of the blood or secretions of 500 sick people, found a new virus. Now, at the same time, nobody took a matched example of 500 people who were either normal or had a mild cough and examined them and said, no, none of them have this virus in their blood. As far as I know, that didn't happen. And then they didn't purify the virus because there's no examples in the literature of purified virus in the millions. And they didn't inject it into an animal. And so we have no idea whether that virus created that disease. We don't know if it's a new disease. We never purified the virus. Instead, what they did was say, oh, we looked through their secretions and we probably found hundreds, thousands of viruses, because it turns out we have a virome, like a microbiome. Mm-hmm. So we have all these viruses living all over the place. They're basically just genetic material. We don't even know if you, because the current theory of viruses is, like I said, there's these pieces of DNA. A lot of times it could be, or let's say a different way. One of the theories is it's a piece of degraded DNA from you, from your cells, that gets packaged up. So it could be that you're poisoned and you secrete these exosomes, they're called, and that's what we call viruses. That's why it's complicated. And so there, it is true that if you're sick, you have more of these particles in your blood. That's a kind of detoxification mechanism. Or it's a communication mechanism from one cell to the other saying, there's a poisoning here, we should do something. It gets very complicated. That's just life. Mm-hmm. The problem is, if you don't prove that it's a, quote, virus that's in the blood of all these people, you can't use a surrogate test, which is what they're using to prove that people have this virus. And the surrogate test, therefore, has false positives and false negatives. We don't even know how many false positives because you can't compare it to anything that's true. In other words, if you never count the number of feet, you never know how many, what false number you get if you just count shoelaces. Anyways, I went on a while there, but that's what people need to know here.
Well, I think viruses are confusing anyway. Just the fact that we call them microorganisms, because it's not an organism. It's like, even it's so abstract.
It's a piece of genetic material packaged up in a membrane of your own cell. And like I said, there's many different possibilities of how this came about. It could be an infection. It could be a degradation of your cell. It could be a messenger between cells. It could be a lot of things. Those are the three big theories right now. And it could be, in some cases, each one of those.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because it's not an organism, because it's just a piece of genetic material, it's interesting for me to think about, what's the intelligence of a virus? Like, what is the, like... There
is no intelligence of a virus. This sort of wily virus, people say, oh, this is a wily virus that changes its nature, to attack people. And I would love to ask them, so we have a piece of RNA, we have a protein, and we have a capsule from our cell. Exactly which part of that is the wily part? which part is the one that's trying to confuse you?
Well, it can't be your own cell.
I mean, it's complicated. It could be, you know, when you poison a tree, right? Or when the beetles are eating a tree, the tree makes chemicals which go down through its roots to send signals to other trees to defend itself against that beetle attack. And the other trees do that by making certain chemicals which make them look like they're sick in order to create toxins that the beetles don't want to eat, and then they save themselves. So viruses could be that. You poison, you know, an organism like a person with, you know, glyphosate or genetic modified organisms or aluminum or mercury or wireless radiation or lots of things. All those, quote, degrade the DNA in the cells. So you get degraded DNA, the cell sends signals to the other tissues and organs saying, we have a problem here, and so defend yourself. So the organism makes a cell-mediated reaction in order to defend itself. We call that being sick, and now you have an epidemic.
So you're saying that the surrogate testing in general can only happen like if we have tested blood before, like if we have tested and then tested against healthy people and then isolated and injected in animals and like proven that exists, and then we can use surrogate testing. But they just use surrogate testing. We don't even know what this virus really is. I mean, we know that it's
So there's a long history of surrogate testing. The guy who came up with the particular surrogate testing that's being used now, called RT-PCR, it stands for reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction. The guy's name was Kary Mullis. And he was very clear. This was originally used to demonstrate that HIV causes AIDS. And Mullis was very clear. You cannot use this test for diagnostic purposes, he said. He said that unless you have a gold standard, which means you purify, isolate, and all those things I just said, you have nothing to compare this to, which is why, for instance, in AIDS tests where they do these so-called viral loads, which is a PCR test, it says in the package insert, don't use this for diagnostic purposes, which is bizarre because that's how it's used. So what is it used for? Well, he said that if you have a lot of degradation of the DNA, it will take less cycles in order for it to show up on my color monitor thing. In other words, if you have just one piece of this DNA that you're looking for, and then you amplify it through these cycles. So you have one piece and that makes 2, that makes 4, that makes 8, that makes 1 million, that makes 2 million, that makes 10 million, right? You amplify it. At a certain level, it'll change the color of your reagent, and then you say you have a positive test. If that test happens with fewer cycles, and then it happens with more cycles, that means that whatever it is got better, because you have less degradation of your DNA. That's what the test was meant to follow people who you already know have this viral or bacterial infection. Then you can use a surrogate test. In other words, if you count everybody's feet in 10 different cities, and every one of them, they have one shoelace per foot, and you know that's the case, then you can count shoelaces and see if there's more or less shoelaces in that city, not somewhere else, because you don't know whether that city has one shoe store. But if you have one city, so you can use it for that. The problem is it's going to give you, if you do 100 cycles, so they're telling us this is a novel and unique piece of RNA. But it turns out if you do this, if you do 36 cycles, everybody's negative on the test because it's not enough cycles to make it show up. So you do 37 cycles and then you get positives, but you get false negatives. We don't even know really what a negative or positive is because we don't have anything to compare it to. But if you do 100 cycles, everybody is positive. So that means everybody has a little piece or something that's close enough to that piece to show up positive. So you have to find a sweet spot. 37 cycles, you find it sometimes. 40 cycles, you're now getting 1% false positive, right? Even though we don't really know how many are positive. The problem is if it's 1% false positive, which is low for a biological test, and you test 30 million people like some places they do, you'll get 300,000 people who test positive. Then that's just the false positive rate of the test. And now you have an epidemic. And if you did everybody in the United States, I'm not sure exactly how many people, I think 300 million, that means you'd have 300 positive cases, and then you'd have an epidemic. But what you really have is a test which was not designed to diagnose whether somebody has the infection or not, because there's nothing to compare it to. This is crazy. And it's not the first time they've done this. This is, I don't know how many times. For those of you who are interested, I have a book you should read. It's called Virus Mania. It's by a German guy named Klaus Kohnlein, Kohnlein. And he documents this whole history of this sort of bogus way we've ascribed viral causation to lots of diseases with no justification at all.
Everything that we're being told is not true. And
this is obviously my opinion. And as I said in the beginning, if somebody shows me these 500 people with the electron microscope, I will recant and say they did what they're supposed to. That was good. And there you go.
Because the whole thing, I've barely been watching the news, but in the news they're saying, these governments are so irresponsible because we need more testing. But it's more of the same ineffective test that's not telling us anything.
Yeah, they're even going public. The CDC had on its website the problems with the test. The problem is that if you don't have, I don't know how many, I know it gets boring and this guy keeps talking about the same thing over and over again, but this is the important thing to realize. And let me give people another example, because if I say, or somebody says, I'm questioning the viral causation here, the immediate response you get is, so what causes this? Which I would submit is a ridiculous question, because let's just say for now, I don't know what caused it. Here's an analogy. So every day you go running on a track, and in the middle of the track there's a football field and it has a grassy field on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're running on the track, and then one morning you come there and there's a huge boulder about 5 stories high, half of the football field, laying on the grass in the middle of the field. And the grass is perfectly normal. There's no hole, there's no dent, the grass is just normal. And then you hear on the news, a meteor, 5 stories high, 50 yards long, fell in the grass in a football field in Lubbock, Texas. And then next thing you know, there's a huge media thing about this meteor that fell to the ground, and it's in this field in Lubbock, Texas. That's where you're running. Now, if you're running and you say to yourself, you look at this and you say, I think if this thing fell from the sky like that, it would probably make a hole in the grass, right? And it didn't. So I'm not sure I'm buying the meteor fell from the sky 3,000 feet high, and now it didn't make a dent in the grass. And so I would want to investigate the veracity of that story. And then somebody says to me, yeah, but Tom, so how did it get there? And I would say, I don't know, I wasn't there. Maybe somebody put it there with a crane. Well, why would they do that? I don't know. I mean, in this case, I have all kinds of theories and speculations and possibilities. We know viruses are messengers. We're seeing certain pieces of RNA which we haven't seen before. Maybe there's a new toxicity in the world. Maybe it's an accumulated toxicity. Those are the things which, it would be great to prove. Some people, including myself, have speculated that, new kinds of electromagnetic fields like 5G, which I hear is being rolled out in Wuhan. I have, articles, eyewitness people send stuff. The Chinese government makes proclamations. Is it true that they rolled out 5G in Wuhan? I mean, I don't know, but they say they did, and they say they did on the cruise ship. To me, that warrants investigation. But I can't emphasize enough, the first thing is, I don't know if I like the story of the meteor falling from the sky and not making a dent in the grass. Mm-hmm. That seems a little weird. And before we criticize or complain that I don't know how it got there, which I don't, because I wasn't there and I don't know. I mean, somebody said on the internet, somebody came with a forklift and put it there. Is that true? I don't know. I mean, at least then you could possibly do that without disturbing the grass.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think about all of this social distancing? I mean, if it's
a virus, that's one thing. Prove the viral causation first.
Okay, but proving the viral causation is not going to happen. So,
well, then there's nothing to talk about.
Okay. Well, okay, it's interesting now because people are like all of a sudden really interested in supporting their immune systems. What can we do to have a healthy body? I mean, how do we support health? Like, get sunshine, have a garden, like things that we should be doing all the time. Like, basically, we should just be human. Like, to have a healthy immune system, you just have to do human things, like walk outside and, you know.
I know I keep doing this to you, but let me reframe the question here a little bit.
Okay.
Right? And then maybe we can wrap it up. But
Okay.
the question, so Tom, whose side are you on anyways? And here's whose side I'm on. I'm on the side of the whales and the dolphins and the daffodils and the birds and the bees and the insects and the children. That's whose side I'm on. 3 months ago, if you had asked me, what do you think we should do to help the birds and the bees and the dolphins and all the rest of those things I said, I don't remember all the names. I would have said, number one, get rid of all the poisons in the oceans and the earth. That means all insecticides, all pesticides, all glyphosate, all artificial fertilizers. Let's have only regenerative or biodynamic agriculture. Let's make sure there's no poisons in the water. Let's make sure there are no wireless devices and electrosmog. Let's make sure people, well, I could go into a lot of things. Let's make sure people aren't spraying toxic stuff in the air. And let's make sure people eat real food. And let's make sure people go outside and have connection with animals and plants and the sun and the earth. Let's do that and see what happens.
Okay.
So it's the same now. Let's do that. What do I think we should do? That. Clean up our act. It's about time.
Well, I wonder if that's going to happen.
We will see.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, but, the good thing is that we're at a crossroads where this is so egregious that people are either going to see that we can't go on poisoning the world. So let me maybe just leave you with this, and I said this on a interview thing or a lecture I gave. If you go to a place that has dolphins, and you're a famous dolphin doctor, and you've been there for decades, and the dolphins are fine. And then you go there, and they call you and say, Tom, some of the dolphins are getting sick. Can you come and try to find out? And you have one question to ask them. And I'll give you a multiple choice question. Question one, is there some genetic problem of the dolphins? Question two, is there some virus these dolphins have? Question number three, did somebody put some toxic stuff in the water?
You're going to ask question three.
Exactly. Because that's what happened. Somebody poisoned the water. That's the environment the dolphins live in. That's why they're sick. Here was another example. When I was growing up, right outside my house, there was a wetlands. And there was all these frogs in it, and they croaked all night and kept me up. And I tried to tape the windows shut because it made a racket. And then around when I was maybe 8 or 10, they stopped croaking. And then by 10, the frogs were all dead. Again, here's three choices for what happened. The frogs have a genetic disease. Number two, the frogs had a virus. Number three, somebody put some DDT in the water and killed all the frogs.
Number
and
three.
I can tell you, it turns out that's what happened.
I guess the thing is that humans have been susceptible to infectious disease like even thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago when we were earthing and when we were eating hunted food and eating organ meats and like eating wild plant foods and and taking in sunshine on our skin. So like so why is it different now? Like hasn't it always been that like infectious disease, whether viral, bacterial, or whatever, has always and will always like cull human population?
So, as I said, I didn't say necessarily I didn't say that microorganisms can't, quote, cause disease, or at least look like they are.
Right.
That's why I gave the example of meningococcus.
Right.
If you inject meningococcus into you, then you will get sick. If you inject millions of copies of chickenpox virus into a person, they will get sick. With the viruses, it's more complicated because there's now theories that they're actually acting not as infectious agents, but as messengers. Mm-hmm. They're messengers that something is happening. So when you go back in all these plagues, a lot of them were associated very clearly with deterioration of the living environment of the people. Mm-hmm. Crowded cities, starving people, plagues, wars, blah, blah, blah. So it's not so clear that healthy people, the way you're describing, were actually so susceptible to epidemics.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not possible, because it could be. I'm not saying there isn't infectious disease, because there certainly are amoebic dysentery, and any person who drinks amoeba will get diarrhea. And as far as I can tell, anybody who gets meningococcus will get sick. That's a different thing, and that's why there are rules to this game. There's rules to finding out. And if we allow the authorities to not use the rules, we will be susceptible not to pandemics of viruses, but pandemics of fear.
Yeah.
And we have an extremely degraded environment that, like the dolphins are swimming in. And if anybody doesn't believe that, and anybody thinks, well, my place is perfectly clear, I mean, frankly, you're dreaming. Because there is no non-toxic place on Earth.
Well, I hope that we can get our act together. I kind of doubt it, but I don't want to seem like a downer, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we can do it, but we kind of need some sort of like divine force that
there are helpers out there who are on our side. People of good cheer and of good faith need to put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
And understand that we have to go towards the good. Mm-hmm. The good is creating this life that we all know in our hearts is possible. And it's a life without poisons, without wireless radiation 24/7 bombarding our tissues and cells, without hatred, without fear, without glyphosate, without aluminum in the air, and I could go on and on. We all know that's true. We've been sold a bill of goods, and it's about time we wake up and create the world that we know is possible.
Okay, well, that's what I'm going to do today.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Cowan. I hope you have a really good day.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.